Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a great lineup as we just got introduced. I want to start off about the panel is about mistakes, about mistakes to avoid as a first-time entrepreneurs, and you guys have the best of the best to talk about it here. A little bit about SVB. SVB is the bank of probably most of you know already, but SVB is the bank of the world's most innovative companies and VCs. Approximately, just from a data standpoint, we bank approximately 50% of the venture-backed companies, and we also bank 2/3 of the VCs themselves. But if you're interested in knowing more about SVB, feel free to ping me offline as well. I want to just go to the panelists and have them do a brief intro about their company and maybe one interesting fact about your background. Todd, if you want to start.
Oh, I hadn't thought about the interesting fact. Okay. My name is Todd Green. I am the most recently co-founder and CEO of a company called PubNub, which is a TiE Angels invested company. And previous to that, I started a company, well, I actually pivoted a company to something called Loyalize, sold that to the owner of American Idol, and before that was a founder of a company called Cascadeworks. So I've made lots of mistakes. And that's probably not the surprising thing about my background. The surprising thing about my background probably is I haven't made 100% mistakes. So that's probably the most surprising thing.
Jeremy.
Great. My name is Jeremy Almond. I'm the CEO of a company called Paystand, which is also a TiE-funded company. Basically spent 15 years of my career in the enterprise financial software. And I would say what Paystand does is we basically do what consumer companies like PayPal or Venmo do, making cashless transactions easy for consumers. We do between complicated commercial transactions with invoices, POs, accounts receivable, accounts payable. I would say that maybe an interesting fact is I certainly didn't think I'd have my career in financial services when I was a kid. Maybe I wanted to be an astronaut, so this is like the last thing I would think to do. But like entrepreneurship, I think you find your passion in unexpected places. So like many of you in the room, my family is an immigrant background, and they sort of epitomize the American dream. They bought their first house after 15 years, and then in the 2008 financial crisis, they lost that house. And that incited in me a notion that what's great about technology is you can imagine the world not as it is, but as it ought to be. And so I spent a lot of time since then exploring how can financial services be improved and how can we actually be change agents for good. So,
That's great.
Hi, Matt Conover. I think when Priya said best of the best, she meant with making mistakes. So I think that will be a common
No, you guys
theme
will
here.
know more.
I'll start with the interesting fact because probably chronologically that's easier to do. Going back to the late 90s, which is kind of all the way back, I started a group that TechCrunch called the $1 Billion Hacker Club. And actually a lot of interesting companies came out of that one, like Napster, Plaxo, CloudMark, WhatsApp, Duo Security, and then Cloud Volumes, which is the one that I was involved with. Cloud Volumes is now part of VMware, but it's basically a way to better manage applications and virtual machines. So don't install and update the same applications over and over again in multiple virtual machines when they're all using the same storage. And so I was the CTO of that one.
Great. Awesome. All right. They're being really humble, but we'll dive right in as to what they've learned or how they can share some of the learnings that they've gone through. I think, Todd, when we were talking about, we know 9 out of 10 startups trend shows that they fail. It is a hard truth. There are several categories, I think, in your words that you mentioned when we talked offline. There are sales failures, product failures, marketing failures, external environment failures. That's just beyond our control. Maybe I would love to hear panel's perspective on each of your journey, and each of your journeys that you mentioned, one category that stood out the most, and what would the advice for a first-time entrepreneur be to avoid that?
Category in the sense of?
Which are the, is it a sales, is it a big deal,
right,
or a product failure or marketing?
I broadly say from my experiences as an entrepreneur that, it breaks down into two things, the things you don't control and the things you do. It sounds obvious, but we spend a lot of time, if we're not careful, worrying about things we don't control. We're worrying about the markets, the ability to fundraise. That's going to be a hot time to fundraise. What's the competitive environment look like? Or is a competitor going to jump up and do something? Those are things you don't control. You obviously need to be cognizant of so that you can maneuver your way around those things. But but the things that you do control, we usually use the term execution, but it's much broader than just doing the right thing. It's about putting together the right teams, putting together the right mindset and the right culture. I guess, there's so many things. We talked about this as we were preparing for this panel, how many different areas we could talk about. One interesting anecdote I thought was interesting was that when I started this company, PubNub, and when we were about 8 or 9 people, it became pretty clear that we didn't have a culture in the company, a small group of people that was working. And this was my first experience that this had happened. I'd done many other, a few other companies before and been on many other teams. But for some reason, things weren't clicking. And we had a wide distribution of ages, of backgrounds, of experience levels, and in this small group of 9 people. And we actually came together and actually just had an open conversation about this and realized that people's perceptions of what it meant to be at a startup were actually very different. For me and for some of the people who'd been around for a while, it was, it's nose to the grindstone, it's working, a lot of hours, it's being ruthless. And for some of these people, especially some of the younger people, I was surprised to find that they had taken a job at a startup because they felt it would be an easier job, that they wouldn't have to work as hard, and that it could be more of a lifestyle job. So,
and it's a cool thing to do.
And it looks cool, in bars. I work at a startup. So what we had to do was very explicitly define 4, now as of recently 5 values for the company that we hire against, that we try to live, work against those values. And I was part of deciding a core value group for a company in the past when I was in my 20s, and I thought, it's probably a waste of time. But the fact that we really embody those values, we give out core value awards, it really helps continue to focus us on that execution thing we talked about. And so that really was, I think, a failure in the sense of not articulating what it means to be as part of an entrepreneur and what you expect of an early stage team, and making sure that the people you hire really conform to those values.
Right.
That's good. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything as strategic as that, but I would say over the course of many failures as a startup, because you probably fail more often than you actually succeed. I think one of the first technology startups I did just failed absolutely miserably. And I think one of the reasons why is, especially if you come from a technology background or an engineering background, you often focus on where your comfort zone is. And so one of the things I know I did, and I've seen other entrepreneurs do this as well, is you might spend 12, 18, 24 months building a product, and you don't spend nearly as much time, if not more time, actually figuring out the go-to-market afterwards. And so I would say, however long you think it's going to take to build and get the product right, and that includes doing lean startups and talking to customers, after it's actually out, you need to spend at least as much time understanding it. And I think I see a lot of people give up too early there. And I think there's a lot of good things about lean startups and the culture that's created, but one of the downsides that culture has created is people give up too early. And the reality is, when you're crossing the chasm, go-to-market is really, really hard. And so you need to expect that you're going to spend just as much of those late night, hard hours that you were doing when you were in the garage stage of the startup as you do when you're in the actual go-to-market and scaling stage of the startup. And I think that's where a lot of grit is born, because that's hard stuff. But I think that's actually where great companies are born, and you create the culture that we were talking about.
That's great. And Matt, specifically to you, your company was acquired at a seed stage prior to raising any institutional round. I mean, which is, that segment is very near and dear to my heart, because that's what our group does. So just adding on to the previous question, I want to also add on to say, what are some of the key challenges specifically to that jump that you made that would also highlight what are some things what's your advice to your entrepreneur to avoid those?
Sure. There are many. I think probably hiring was the hardest one, especially being at the seed stage. That kind of narrows the pool of really good people that you can choose from, and that also means you'll probably make some mistakes there, some compromises, and so on. And I think we certainly made some mistakes, but we had a few great people that helped to balance it out. You know what I mean? But we certainly made some mistakes with hiring. Obviously, sales is a problem because we were doing enterprise sales. It's kind of hard to work with Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 companies when you're seed funded. So they have to really want to work with you to get over that hurdle. But no matter what startup you're going to do, I mean, obviously the key one is to make sure you're actually solving a problem that customers have that they care about. And so I do think we were fortunate that despite all of our challenges, never having raised venture funding at the time we required and everything, you do certainly have to make sure that you're solving a problem that somebody will pay for, because otherwise you will die very quickly. And we were fortunate that the idea that we started with is the idea that we exited with. So that certainly helped that we didn't have to go through like a pivot or things like that, which would be probably even more taxing. But I mean, we went like 3.5 years at the time we were acquired, and so it's like the main thing is try to keep a team together that still, you know, has the drive and the patience and the belief and so on. And so there are a lot of benefits with not raising a venture round. I mean, obviously it worked out financially for everybody, but you also have to kind of keep the team together to get to the finish line.
End. That's
a lot of top ramen.
That's right. That's right. Todd, to you, I mean, I think you mentioned earlier on a little bit, as a serial entrepreneur, and you founded and sold several successful companies, and currently as CEO of PubNub, which is at Series C stage, you know, you've been in the ecosystem since 1999. So I'd love to hear from you. How has the startup environment changed from then to now? And I think, Matt, you and I just talked about just before the panel and how things have changed from even last year to this year. Love to hear you guys' thoughts on it.
Sure. I actually joined my first startup in '96 and started my first startup as a founder in '99. I think '96 was interesting, right? But, you know, the internet was just coming up and people were deciding that they could build applications on it. So it was no longer just a place to look at, you know, brochures of companies, but a place where people were doing application development. And that was also when a lot of, you know, there was kind of that first big wave of internet startups happening. And we really didn't know how to structure companies. We didn't, you know, there's a lot more sort of, a lot of roles were much less defined. And we were adopting some ideas from bigger companies that didn't necessarily play. So I think, you know, the challenges back then were a lot about, you know, just some of the things that are almost just basic hygiene today, we're still trying to figure out back then. And I think there was also more of an antagonistic relationship between investors and board members and founding teams. And, you know, there was, you know, hair trigger to replace the founding team or replace the CEO or do things like that. And now what I see, you know, now is, first of all, there's much more codified how-tos and best practices for getting some stuff off the ground. In fact, a lot of people outside of Silicon Valley, you know, we like to look at people outside of Silicon Valley and say, oh, they don't have the basic hygiene stuff down, you know, because it's almost so codified now, it's kind of scary almost. And I think investors and board members and executive teams generally are playing better together and providing more value than they used to. So I think there's a lot of positive things going on there. But I do think, you know, there's been so much money pumped into, you know, sort of trend-based ideas, like lemmings types of things, that it is hard when you're looking to do something, you know, much bigger to kind of attract the attention of an investor who's looking for a short exit. So I think there's still expectations that change in terms of payback periods based on the economy and things like that are going on.
That's great.
I don't know how clear that was.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Matt or Jeremy, any comments on that one?
Well, I can add something there. You know, 10 years ago, I don't think Cloud Volumes would have been able to be founded, right? Meaning, you know, we were entering a market that venture capitalists were already kind of disillusioned with. I think incorrectly so, because there were problems that needed to be solved. But they put a lot of money into that space, and I think they kind of, you know, we were in the downside of the hype cycle at the time. You know, in our case, the Thai angels funded us, and that you know, the angels are what enabled us to exist. I think 10 years ago, that might not have been an option. And so you know what I mean? So I think that certainly, like the rise of seed funding and angel funding, I think has become a big thing. And certainly for us, that was like required. I mean, I guess that's probably the main one I could think to point out there.
Right. And I think that ties in. The next thing I wanted to talk about is when we were discussing the panel, one thing that kept coming up as a common mistake is fundraising. You know, of course, the panelists are going to have different kind of views on it, but like, what is the right time to raise fundraising, and should we look at alternative sources of funding, and what is it, and what's right for my company? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you know, what some of those are.
Yeah, I think you're hearing from everyone that fundraising certainly has changed a lot over the last, I don't know, 10 plus years. I think there's a couple macro trends that are happening. One is, especially at the early stage, discrete fundraising events are not quite the same. So letters are harder to deal with. That's been probably true over the last couple years. There's like pre-seed, angel, seed, post-seed, secondary seed. People ask what we are. I don't even know what to say anymore, to be honest. But the good part of that is, I would say that an enormous amount of new types of capital have come into the industry. So that's true at the early stage. So you have early institutional seed, which is really good for companies when they're getting off the ground. And then you also have alternative sources. So I think one of the things we're fascinated with as a financial service company is just banking in general, financial services in general, and certainly in venture, that model is getting disrupted a bit. So you have outside influences that are coming in, PEs are coming in from the top side, and then you even have maybe longer term trends like ICOs that are happening over the blockchain where traditional banks may not be the only source of capital. We're also seeing it in cases where lending is happening in areas where software companies didn't get traditional debt or lending. And so I think all of that means that founders have more options. They have more ways to think about the business, which is really good. And you can pick your strategic partners well, because the thing that VCs still do very, very well is if you pick the right partner, they can be inflection points for you. So now the good thing for an entrepreneur is you can be more discriminatory on picking the right partners. And then the outside capital can just be that extra capital.
That's right.
Yeah, I guess just to add on to that, if you're specifically doing a software startup, SaaS or infrastructure software startup, and I'm going to contradict myself here and be because we didn't follow this route. But you have much more of an opportunity to really bootstrap your own company. Yeah. And I think, I talk to so many entrepreneurs who come to talk to me and ask about fundraising, and you kind of look at what they're doing. You may not have to raise. I mean, it's one of those things you almost feel like you have to do, and it's a badge of honor. Oh, I raised $5 million round or $10 million round. But frankly, you don't have to, right? I mean, what exists today that didn't exist before, right? So you've got AWS, right? You can pay by the minute, right? Or pay by the hour for your services and your servers, right? So you don't have to have any kind of capital cost for that. You don't have to hire an enterprise sales force necessarily for your business. I mean, sometimes you choose to, but you can actually sell online. It was amazing to me. No one knew. So really, I'll just quick anecdote. PubNub today, we have 100 employees. We have 1,000 customers. We do infrastructure for real-time applications. I didn't talk about that. Go to pubnub.com. Every company in this room needs it. Okay, but now the anecdote is, when we started the company, no one knew we were 1.5 people. I was the CEO of another company doing this on the side on the weekends, and my co-founder was working 7 days a week on PubNub. And we put up a website and built some APIs and a simple billing system, and all of a sudden we had 30 customers using our infrastructure at 100 transactions a second, right? Now, that was really, I give all credit to my co-founder who's not only building the infrastructure, but going to meetups and putting up the web page. And you can actually build a business without the traditional kinds of sales and marketing and infrastructure you needed to. And then if you do need to get capital, there are other approaches to venture, to equity funding, right? Yeah. That you can look at as well. So I think there's just this feeling, I need to have VC money, but it's not necessarily the case for low, capital intensive businesses anymore.
Yep. Matt, do you want to add on to?
I
know yours is a little different.
Just to add to what Todd said, I actually totally agree with that. I think you have to adjust the amount of funding you are raising to the business you're going after, and there will be some businesses that can be financially great for all employees and investors, right, but which can't sustain or support the VC model. Right. And so, if you're going after a huge market and everything, venture capital can be the way to go, but you are signing yourself up for 7 to 10 years, and it's a journey. Right. If you're going after a different size market, it can actually be beneficial to do that, right? I mean, with angel funding and seed funding, and on the positive side, you will probably not have that many competitors because they will all face the same funding challenges. And so I think my just general suggestion there would be to tailor the amount of funding you raise to the problem or market you're going after.
Yeah.
That's great. Another topic that came about is talent. And I think you guys briefly touched on it before. Attracting top talent is difficult, period. And each stage has its own challenges to attract talent, especially from an early stage. I see it's a lot more challenging until you've built that brand up. And so does scaling teams when you're at a Series C stage as PubNub. So I'd love to hear from you guys, and what are some of the challenges that you've faced, and how can the first-time entrepreneurs avoid those?
It's horrible. I think it's a weird matchmaking game. It's like going to a bar and hoping you're going to meet a spouse, right? I mean, you need to hire a particular role at a particular point in time, and you hope that there's a particular person looking for a job at that particular point in time. And it ties to the go-to-market strategy too. If these people are involved in your go-to-market strategy, who you hire is going to help define that. So I don't even know how to define talent, because a person who may be great in one role, one go-to-market strategy, may be not that great for the next. And so it's this random chance matchmaking thing. It's like, you know, it's horrible. It's just, I hate, it's the worst thing, right? Because you just, so much of who you hire is going to define so much about the future of your company, and it's so much based on luck and timing. And so yeah, it's a very, I don't have a great any advice other than just like, you know, don't even be entrepreneurs, actually. No, I'm kidding.
How do you follow that? So, I hear like on these panels, people always say things on the funding side, like always be raising. I think maybe more important for a founder is always be hiring. Because every person you're talking to is somebody who ultimately is actually the right fit. And I would say a couple things that maybe can be helpful. One, really know the why of your business, because especially at the early stage, like, people could be making a lot more money. They could be having a way easier life. So for them to sacrifice to come and be part of your dream and help you build something great that has impact on the world, they really need to understand why that is. And so articulating that so they understand the mission and can get behind the mission. I think in a lot of days, your earliest employees are missionaries. And so really finding the right fits there. I think that's the strategic thing. And then the tactical thing in the Valley, because it is so hard to find great people and everybody's fighting over the same people, is find something that you have a competitive advantage, or you're just uniquely different. Like in our case, we just made a conscious effort. We were going to put our office 10 minutes from the beach in the redwood trees, right? And so what we said was, we want people who are going to work hard and play hard, because we're working on a hard problem, and it's going to be a 10-year plus problem, and so we don't want people to burn out. We don't want prima donnas, but at the same time, we were specifically looking for a certain type of person that was swinging big and swinging long. And so I think being able to articulate with that person, and then orientating your company around it, is really helpful.
That's right.
I think, so as a technical founder, I think the biggest problem I had there is I didn't spend enough time on hiring. I actually really hate the hiring process, and I wanted to just get back to working on the product. And so it was kind of like I was trying to minimize the time spent on it, and I was just interviewing based on technical skills and so on. So one thing I learned fairly early on is that you have to also look at the non-technical stuff. Like, will this person get along with the other people on the team and things like that, right? So I think one big problem there is I was trying to minimize the time spent on hiring. The other thing is I was narrowly focused on a certain set of things I was interviewing for, and I should have been far broader. So I think that was really my lesson learned, is that I probably should have spent probably 5 times more time on hiring than I did, and it would have avoided a lot of the mistakes that we had. Luckily, I mean, there's a lot of luck in startups, obviously, so I think we just lucked out that we had a few great people that like helped to offset the bad hires. The other related one to that is, when things aren't working out, deal with them while they're small problems before they become big problems, because they eventually will. And that was the other thing, is similar to the just wanting to work on the product, just get back to coding, let problems fester far longer than I should have. So.
Let me just, one thing I want to add, and I completely agree with that, and just in all seriousness, I mean, the thing you learn is hire for the problem you have now. You know, you meet people who are great, and you go, gosh, you know, a year from now when we're twice as big, this guy's going to knock it out of the park. Don't hire that person. Hire the person who's going to solve the tactical problems that they will either scale with you or not, and you can solve that later. But you know, the mistake that I think we've all made is sometimes hire the big shiny object, you know, on the hill, but that's not necessarily who you need right now.
Right, and one thing that just reminds me that I keep hearing is hire slow, fire fast in the startup ecosystem. What do you guys think about that part, especially the firing side?
You know, there's some phrase someone told me once, no one's ever said, what is the phrase exactly? I waited, no one's ever said, oh, I should have waited longer to fire that person, right? No one's ever uttered those words in seriousness, right? So I think when you know. Sometimes, you know, I think your gut is right about 60-70% of the time on hiring, but when someone's not working out, you know 100% of the time, and everything else is procrastination.
Right. I do have a question from the Ti app, so if you guys do have questions, feel free to put it on so I can try to pull this up as well. Anyone can take this up, but the question is, there are many accelerators, incubators that's out there. Do you guys suggest first-time entrepreneur to join? Why or why not? And how to choose which one is the best one? Dave McClure is coming up next, so he might tell you 500 startups might be the best one. So, but I'll let the panel hear as well.
Well, I mean, I guess I would say I would tailor it to what, I guess, same theme I've been saying, I would tailor it to what you're doing. If you're going to do something in enterprise, there may be better options than, say, if you're going to do something in consumer. So I would really adjust it to the problem you're going after, and like choose something that where the people you'll be working with have experience in the space you're going to go into.
That's great. That's great. How about you guys? Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that one?
Yeah, actually, I'm a big believer in accelerators, particularly for first-time entrepreneurs, because in a lot of ways, your network, getting things off the ground are so critical, whether that's for sales or hiring or funding later on. And so good accelerators are specifically designed for that. And those are sort of all of the ancillary areas where if you're a first-time entrepreneur and you're just focused on product or you're just focused on sales, you oftentimes need help. I would say that be discriminatory again on which accelerators, because I've probably personally been part of, I don't know, 4 or 5, and some are very, very good, and some are not so good, and so I would take a lot of time vetting other entrepreneurs who've been part of that accelerator to find out what it is they give you. Were they helpful for you for introductions? Were they helpful for you for fundraising? Were they helpful for you for hiring? Were they helpful for you to get you to customers? Right. What did they actually do? Because a $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 check, that's the least important thing that an accelerator does.
Great, thank you. You know, we're going to do closing thoughts, but one thing that stands out for me from just hearing these folks just here and also offline is grit. I think grit kind of takes you from where you want to be to, you know, where you're going to be at the end, right? So it's just going through, and failures are kind of the path of the journey, and how you deal with it is some of the things that hopefully you can take away, key takeaways from the panelists right here. So maybe last closing thoughts, if you have one advice that for the folks to take away from here to avoid as a first-time entrepreneur, what would that be?
I think for me, I made a ton of mistakes, but one thing I think that when I've, talking about grit, when I've stuck my committed the next N years or whatever to whatever I'm doing, I've never had any doubts. Now, maybe I should have, because there's a fine line between grit and stupidity, completely. But, I really, how they talked about Steve Jobs' reality distortion field? I've always created a reality distortion field of 1. Like, I really believe, I 100% believe, and I continue to believe in the things that I've done or I do. I mean, I may be wrong, but I 100%, I never have doubts. I think that's really important, because as soon as you're not sure. Now, you can have doubts tactically, is this the right sales model, is this the right product? But, if you believe there's a problem out there that's worth solving, that you're going to commit the next, huge percentage of your time and life to, you can't waver in that. And that's what drives the grit, for me at least. I think that's the most important thing in terms of, continue to move forward.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're all going to make mistakes. The question is, do you have perspective in how not to make that mistake again and to see the mistake in yourself, right? Because there's always a certain amount of hubris, I think, in entrepreneurship. So I would say the single biggest thing is get out of the Valley's bubble. And I think that's helpful in a bunch of ways. First, I think about some of the earliest hires we had are folks that I knew outside of life in the Valley, because you want to know those people at real level. Second, I think there are huge problems outside of solving and serving for technology companies. I mean, there's a lot of huge businesses in Middle America. There's a lot of real big problems in the rest of the world, and I think sometimes we're super insular about whatever the latest buzzword is here. So I think they might not be sexy, but there's a bunch of really amazing things that entrepreneurs can focus on, and being outside of the Valley is a huge, huge area. And then lastly, it gives you perspective. I usually spend some time between startups, just outside in the world a lot, and I think at the end of the day you can build, you can risk much if you see that at the end of the day there are big, beautiful things outside of the world with amazing people, that we're all together as one, and so I think it gives you some perspective on the day-to-day grind that you're going to feel in a startup. So.
Great. Matt?
Yeah, so day-to-day grind, great. These are all the right words. So I think the main one is, and I'm going to say this, and nobody's going to internalize this because I've heard this before and I also failed to internalize it. It will be so much harder than you think. It really will. I mean, it'll impact your family life, it'll impact your sleep, it'll impact your health. I mean, it's like you really have to really want to go after that because, I mean, it is really hard. It takes many years, oftentimes like 5 to 10 years, right? So I mean, it is a serious commitment.
I'm only 29 years old.
But well, yeah. So I mean, I was talking to a fellow entrepreneur just a few days ago, and we were talking about what's after this, and both of us basically said the bar is so high now because now that you know what it's like it is hard to. It is hard. It's hard to go do another thing.
Right. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks panelists for your time as well.